right. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sayuri Romei, and I'm the Associate Director of Programs here at the Mansfield Foundation. Thanks for joining us today for another one of our Capitol Hill Asia Policy Dialogues, or CAP events. Our CAP series invites leading experts and government officials to share their expertise and insights, and it's an opportunity for members of Congress and their staff to learn more about these timely policy issues regarding Asia. As you might know, we used to hold our CAP events on Capitol Hill, but we've been virtual for the past 2 years. Hopefully we can go back to an in-person format very soon. So please stay tuned on our CAP series. And also feel free to email me if you have any questions, requests, or suggestions for speakers, for topics for our series. I will leave my email in the chat later. Before we start, I'd like to thank our corporate friends of Mansfield who make our Capitol Hill Policy Dialogues possible. Thank you so much on behalf of all of us at Mansfield. And I can see some of the names in the list, so it's really great seeing you today. Thank you. Today, we're going to talk about Wednesday's presidential election in South Korea, called by some the Squid Game election. Our two excellent speakers will be talking about what the results mean, what to expect from this new conservative administration. And I'm proud to say that both our speakers today are members of our U.S. Japan Network for the Future. And I'm looking forward to the discussion and especially to the audience's questions. Now over to you, Frank. Frank Januzzi is our president and CEO, and he will introduce the speakers and then moderate the discussion today. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Sayuri. I appreciate this opportunity to get with guests and discuss South Korean politics and the implications for the United States and Japan. The Mansfield Foundation was created by Congress about 40 years ago. To deepen cooperation and mutual understanding between the United States and its partners in Asia. And our outreach to Capitol Hill is one of our proudest legacies. And we really hope that especially those of you on the program this afternoon who may be congressional staff and who have the benefit of working closely with Mark Manyin and drawing on his wisdom on a daily basis, will spread the news about these Capitol Hill policy dialogues to your colleagues if you find them useful. We'd love to have more congressional staff. And we do, as Sayuri said, really look forward to getting back up onto Capitol Hill to host these events as they were meant to be hosted with an informal lunch inside the House and Senate office buildings where we can maximize our opportunity for interaction. Our two speakers today are distinguished not only for their membership in the U.S. Japan Network for the Future, but also for their scholarship. Dr. Celeste Arrington is the Korea Foundation Associate Professor of Political Science and International Affairs at George Washington University. Her research interests include law and social change, comparative policy, and transnational advocacy. Her publications include Accidental Activists, Victim Movements and Government Accountability in Japan and South Korea in 2016, and many journal articles and analyses really focusing in deeply on the place of Japan and Korea in Northeast Asia and how they connect to each other. Dr. Mark Manyin is a specialist in Asian affairs at the Congressional Research Service. Mark and I first met when I was working on Capitol Hill, and he was one of those experts at CRS upon whom staff rely for all of the research and analysis that we don't have time to do. He has served as the head of the Congressional Research Service's 10-person Asia team. He has a doctorate in international affairs from the Fletcher School. Dr. Arrington, her doctorate, well, she was a fellow at Harvard. She's where did your doctorate come, Celeste?
Berkeley, go Bears.
At Berkeley, UC Berkeley, sorry, exactly, right. Mark is also distinguished for the fact that he's a huge Nats fan. And I'm hoping that there will, in fact, be baseball this spring. Dr. Arrington and Dr. Manyin are going to talk to us about the elections, and we thought that we would start with Celeste to really help us better understand who were these candidates running for office, what did the election tend to hinge on, and what can we begin to divine from the election results about where the Republic of Korea may be headed. Over to you, Celeste.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank the Mansfield Foundation and Sayuri and Frank for inviting me today. It's a great opportunity to see many familiar faces among the participants and to join Mark on this panel today. So thank you very much. So South Korea just concluded its closest presidential election of the Democratic era with just 0.73% difference between the victor, Yoon Suk-yeol, a conservative candidate, and the second place, Lee Jae-myung, who is a liberal candidate from the Democratic Party of Korea. The fact that there was no clear, overwhelming winner in this race is a sign of just how disliked both of the leading candidates were. Some 50% of voters, especially in the 20s and 30s, said that they disliked the candidates. So voters were voting for the lesser of two evils in many sense. The polls before the blackout period of 1 week ahead of the elections showed that more than 2/3 of voters who were going to vote for Yoon Suk-yeol were voting in order to change the party in the presidency, not for Yoon or his policies per se. And so I think as President-elect Yoon takes office in early May, he has a tough road ahead, and he does not have an overwhelming mandate to govern. On top of that, the Democratic Party of Korea, the current president Moon Jae-in is from that party, has a supermajority in the National Assembly. So 172 seats for the Democratic Party of Korea, whereas Yoon Suk-yeol's party, the People's Power Party, only has 113 seats. They did well in the by-elections for winning 4 out of the 5 seats that were up for grabs in this election, but still we have sort of a divided government situation. So not only does he not have a clear mandate to govern, but he's going to face a National Assembly, a unicameral legislature in South Korea of the opposite party. So he's going to have to tread carefully as he takes up the presidency, not to incite and anger the other half, the Democratic Party of Korea, as well as figuring out how to compromise if he wants to get anything done in governing Korea. Structurally, the Korean president is more powerful than the National Assembly, but the National Assembly has plenty of leverage, including approving or not approving budgets, to make Yoon Suk-yeol's life as president very difficult. For the Democratic Party of Korea that did not win the presidency in this election, they're going to have to do a lot of hard thinking and regrouping after this election as well. Already last year, they lost the mayoral elections in Seoul and Busan in historic defeats. And this is the first time in Korea that the presidency has switched hands from one party to the other after just one term. So the leadership of the Democratic Party of Korea is already in the process of resigning, and it will need to figure out whether it's going to play a constructive role as supermajority in the National Assembly or an obstructionist role. And so I think in terms of this election, we have a challenge ahead for President-elect Yoon, as well as a challenge ahead for the Democratic Party of Korea. And the fact that this election was about voting for which is the lesser of two evils is an indicator of the divisions in Korean society, as well as low voter trust in the political parties. And the fact that the third candidate, An Chol-soo, who is a center-right candidate, pulled out of the race just about 1 week before the elections and backed the leading candidate, Yoon, who won on Wednesday, is, I think, a problematic sign for the state of Korean political parties. It also has maybe deepened voter distrust in the parties. And this candidate An Cheol-soo had about 10% of the support from voters according to polls. And so his backing of candidate Yoon should have led to a greater victory on Wednesday. But the fact that this was such a close race suggests that former An Cheol-soo supporters probably split their vote, and some backed the Liberal candidate Lee Jae-myung, and others backed Yoon Song-yeol. And so I think ultimately we're left with a very divided Korean electorate. The divisions were most clear among the voters in their 20s. You had, as usual, older voters voting for the conservative candidate Yoon, and voters in their 30s, 40s, and 50s voting more for the Liberal candidate Lee. But in the 20s, you had 2/3 of men voting for the conservative candidate Yoon, and 2/3 of women voting for the Liberal candidate Lee. And the fact that the candidates both played off of this gender war that is brewing in South Korean politics is not healthy for Korean society, and will, it indicates just how important these 20-year-old voters are. Ultimately, we had an acrimonious, mudslinging, scandal-laden election campaign. Throughout it, Yoon, the victor, President-elect Yoon, emphasized blaming the current incumbent, Moon Jae-in, for his policies. And the candidate on the Liberal side, Lee Jae-myung, emphasized Yoon Song-yeol's inexperience. South Koreans elected for the first time a president who has zero governing experience. He was never in the legislature, and nor was he ever a mayor or a governor. So we also have, for the first time, a prosecutor, someone from the prosecution in South Korea becoming president. So let me just wrap up with a few summary thoughts about who were the candidates as a way to kind of parse what their likely policy trajectory will be going forward. On the Democratic Party side, the Lee Jae-myung was, he conceded peacefully, which I think is a good sign for Korean democracy. He was the former Gyeonggi province governor and a human rights lawyer, but he had not been a front runner in the Liberal camp for very long. A rape conviction took another leading candidate out of the running and into jail. But he tended to favor more state-led measures to tackle voters' concerns about housing prices, inequality, and he floated the idea of universal basic income. He also favored more pragmatic diplomacy, which meant balancing between the US and China, assuming a more autonomous foreign policy stance. And he favored continuing the engagement policies with North Korea, like the current incumbent Moon Jae-in. Yoon Song-yeol, on the other hand, the winner of this election, was from the Conservative People's Power Party, but under the current president, Moon Jae-in, he had been prosecutor general for about 2 years. So he is the first prosecutor to be elected president, and he gained a name in prosecuting the former conservative presidents, especially Park Geun-hye and Lee Myung-bak. He ultimately resigned from the Moon Jae-in administration and joined the Conservative People's Power Party in clashing with the president Moon Jae-in over prosecutorial reform. And so whether he keeps the prosecutorial reforms, basically to reduce the power of the prosecution in South Korea, is something that we should watch going ahead. In general, he has favored more private sector solutions to high housing prices and job creation and other economic woes that voters are concerned about. He also favors a harder line on North Korea and maybe tilts slightly more towards China and emphasized throughout bolstering the US-ROK alliance. He also talked about resuscitating Japan-Korea relations, which we're going to talk more about. Now, these are the differences between the two candidates. Ultimately, it seems that voters were voting primarily for a new party in the presidency, not for either candidate. So in exit polling by the terrestrial broadcasters, the top concerns of voters were economic growth and job creation at about 30% of voters. The next were real estate prices, 22% of voters were concerned about that. And then beyond that were political reform and anti-corruption measures, as well as the value that they sought most in the candidates was pursuing fairness and justice. So emphasizing voters' concerns about the deep inequalities in Korean society, which you all have witnessed in the Korean movies and dramas that have gained so much attention. So voters were primarily not voting on the foreign policy issues ultimately, although some exit polls indicate that at the last minute, the diplomatic and security situation, including recent, the Russian invasion of Ukraine may have led voters to make a last minute choice. But compared to the 30% who care about economic growth and job creation, only 3 or 4% care about North Korea policy, for example. So that said, I think these election results do weakly confirm several trends in voters' priorities that are going to facilitate Yoon Suk-yeol's, President-elect Yoon's foreign policy. So I just want to highlight 4 final points. The first is that there's a hardening of distrust and a sense of threat from China among Korean voters. And so some 70 to 80% of Koreans see China as a security and an economic threat. And that will facilitate Yoon Suk-yeol's values-based diplomacy and his tilt a little bit towards the United States in the U.S.-China rivalry. The second point is that while a vocal minority in South Korea is anti-Japanese, the majority of people, especially in the younger generations, do see the need to work with Japan. So according to one poll from last September, 65% of Koreans feel that trilateral relations should be strengthened, and this is up 11% from the previous year. The third point is that Koreans are less tolerant of North Korea. They're less willing to treat it as a special relationship. And especially among the young people, they are the country that they name most as a security threat to South Korea is North Korea. And I think that will that trend will continue. And then the fourth point is that there is overwhelming support for the U.S. ROK alliance among South Korean voters. And the first person that President-elect Yoon spoke to was President Biden on the telephone. He spoke about making the alliance not just about military, but a comprehensive alliance. And I think Mark is going to talk more about that. So thank you.
Thank you, Celeste. Brilliant. I really appreciate your comprehensive overview of what we have just witnessed in South Korean politics and your analysis of why the election may have turned out the way it did. I'm struck by what a low priority the DPRK issue is for many South Korean voters in this election, compared with economic and life concerns like being able to afford your rent, moving out of your parents' home to get your own place and start a family. And I'm struck by the fact that the Moon Jae-in presidency really was dominated by the issue of outreach to the DPRK. President Moon made this the signature priority of his administration. He worked closely with President Trump to try to achieve a dramatic breakthrough on the peninsula, and those efforts ultimately failed. And that the past 6 weeks have been marked by the most intensive period of DPRK missile launches that we've witnessed in many years, as well as the global political instability that you referenced, which may have underscored the importance of the U.S. ROK alliance in the minds of voters at a time of global uncertainty and risk. And then you also touched on China and the fact that the South Korean voters are increasingly anti-China. That was not always the case. But of course, Korea also has huge economic stakes in the China ROK relationship remaining stable, not to mention, of course, the political stakes in terms of Chinese influence over the DPRK. And you've segued beautifully to Mark, who's now going to really, I think, drill down a little bit on the foreign policy implications of this election, especially for the U.S. ROK alliance, as well as the U.S. ROK Japan triangle. Mark, over to you. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Frank, and thanks again for having me here. And it's always great to share a stage or a screen with Celeste. I should apologize for the view that you're sort of looking up at me. I re-aggravated an old neck and shoulder injury a few days ago, and it's hard for me to look up at a higher level camera. So apologize if you're looking right up at my nose. But anyway, this is a really fascinating election for the reasons that Frank and Celeste were mentioning. And what Frank has asked me to do, as he indicated, is to focus on some of the foreign policy implications, particularly those for the United States and the U.S.-South Korea relationship. And I think, overall, just stepping back, I think there's a much greater chance to have much greater alignment between the two countries on many, many issues of importance to the United States and to members of Congress who I work for, and specifically on 3 issues. And these won't come to any surprise for anyone who's been watching, the Indo-Pacific, recently. And those are North Korea, Japan, and China, and all the regional initiatives that are associated with the United States Indo-Pacific policy or strategy. And of course, those are all, centered around China. Before getting into ticking off those, though, I think I'll make just a couple of quick overall observations about what the election has told us. And the first, just to emphasize what Celeste said about attitudes towards the United States and the U.S. alliance. I mean, both Yoon and Lee strongly supported the U.S.-South Korea alliance, which continues to be overwhelmingly popular among the South Korean populace. I mean, recent polls last year showed that 85% of South Koreans support the alliance and its continuing strength. And, we can get into some of the reasons for that. So whereas in the past, say 10 years ago, the degree to which the U.S. and South Korea South Korea should be cooperating with the U.S. was a bit of a political issue. That really has disappeared over the last 10 years or so. It's very dangerous politically for any politicians right now to be seen as opposing strong U.S.-South Korea relations. And again, we can get into more details on whether there was a Trump effect there or not, but we'll leave that to questions. The second theme that I see coming out of this for foreign policy implications is that you see both candidates really championing a strong, more active, more autonomous South Korea. They both envisioned South Korea having a much more prominent role as befitting its growing economic, military, and of course, cultural now power and influence in the world. And I think you see this particularly among younger voters who, as Celeste was indicating, in many ways emerged as the swing vote in this election and in also some recent local elections that South Korea had. Governor Lee tended to channel this desire into a feeling for greater autonomy. And again, we can get into what that meant specifically if you have questions. Whereas Yoon tended to channel it into a view as South Korea as a more powerful partner within the US-led system. He talked about South Korea as a global pivotal country with something to contribute on a range of issues such as climate change, fighting pandemics like COVID, et cetera. So again, both emphasized South Korea's growing clout, but tended to channel that in different ways. Okay, so now looking at the 3 individual issues, North Korea, Japan, and China. And I'll try and be brief here, and then we can get into more details if you have questions and for the discussion. So on North Korea, both candidates, in some ways there was less disagreement here than on some of the other issues, particularly on Japan and China. Both candidates they called for a mix of dialogue and pressure. But Yoon is, as Celeste indicated, is much more likely to emphasize the latter, pressure, which will align more closely with the Biden administration's approach to date. Yoon was highly critical of President Moon's North Korea policy. He felt that it was too accommodating, too focused on dialogue for dialogue's sake. And like many conservatives in South Korea, he has emphasized the need to increase cooperation with the United States. Number one, and number two, he's tended to link inter-Korean relations and progress there to progress in denuclearization. And this fits a theme over the last 15 years or so in South Korea's policy towards North Korea, where progressives tend to de-emphasize any linkages between inter-Korean relations and progress thereby, and de-emphasize the link between that and progress in denuclearization talks, whereas conservatives tend to do the opposite. Yoon, however, he has said that South Korea needs to have a dialogue or have some level of engagement with North Korea. He's called for providing unconditional humanitarian assistance to North Korea. And I think this is something to look for in the future, is with talks with North Korea basically at a standstill. We haven't had anything substantive since 2019. I think we can expect to see perhaps the Yoon camp reaching out to the Biden administration to see if there's some sort of humanitarian package that can be offered to North Korea. One reason for this stalemate with North Korea, perhaps, is that North Korea has really gone into full-fledged hermit mode since the COVID outbreak. They've closed off their borders. So perhaps some sort of big COVID aid package, which to date, North Korea has refused this COVID assistance. But perhaps if there's a bigger package, the thinking might be that might lure them out and then create at least opportunities for dialogue on other issues such as their nuclear and missile programs. So I think in addition to looking for something coming out on the humanitarian aid front, I think other things to look for from the Yoon victory are with North Korea apparently, re-entering a very aggressive missile testing phase. Will Yoon follow through on his promise or idea of calling for new missile defense deployments in South Korea? One such deployment of the so-called THAAD system in 2016, 2017 caused a lot of problems with headaches with China, which we'll get to later. So will he follow through on his pledge to call for that? And in general, just for boosting the extended deterrence dialogue with the United States. Secondly, what's going to happen with military exercises with the United States? Moon really was pushing hard to scale down and cancel large-scale military exercises, which haven't been held essentially since the Singapore summit in 2018. So will those resume? They've basically taken the form of tabletop exercises, but will the large-scale in-person exercises on the ground happen? And then lastly, will we see, particularly if North Korea keeps engaging in these provocative acts, will Yoon follow through on his pledge to, or floating the idea of integrating South Korea into the U.S. Japan missile defense system or not? And this again is likely to antagonize China quite a bit. Frank, how am I doing on time?
You've got another minute.
Another minute? Okay. Let me just quickly blaze through Japan. Yoon has really been pushing hard to improve relations with Japan. This, of course, is music to the ears of folks in Washington because South Korea-Japan ties have been really bad since 2018. For example, the two countries haven't had a summit in 3 years. And things to watch for here are, will there be an early summit? Yoon has called for resuming shuttle diplomacy between the two countries. And I will say a word of caution on this, in that the last South Korean presidential candidate who called for improving Japan-South Korea ties was Lee Myung-bak, who won election in 2007. And after some initially very good collaboration and coordination between the two countries, relations really sank to what was then a low in 2012. So you just, things are unpredictable, particularly with South Korean and Japanese politics there. On China, I think Celeste covered the growing anti-Chinese sentiment in South Korea, and so whatever Yoon's stance, if he takes a hardline stance on South Korea, that will meet with applause from in some quarters in South Korea, more so than in the past. I think the big things to watch here are whether Yoon will follow through on his ideas of South Korea for the first time fully participating in some of the Quad's activities. This is, of course, the Quad is among the U.S., Japan, Australia, and India. And Yoon has talked about South Korea perhaps participating in some of the working groups focusing on supply chains, critical technologies, and also COVID vaccine initiatives. Why don't I stop there, Frank, if that's good, and then we could sort of tease some of this out a little bit more in the discussion.
Thank you so much, Mark. Terrific job of covering a lot of landscape in a short time. I want to follow up right away with you and bring in a question from our audience as well. You touched on Yoon's desire both to improve relations with Japan and also his somewhat cautionary views on China. Colin Timmerman, legislative assistant to Representative Young Kim of California's 39th district, focused in immediately on the politics of divided government. I wonder why. Why would a congressional staffer have that on their mind? And he asks a very appropriate question, which is, all right, how much is President Yoon going to be constrained by this divided government, both with respect to any outreach he may make toward Japan, for instance, where he's got a supermajority in the National Assembly from a party that has been, I would say, a bit more skeptical about making any moves toward Tokyo to resolve outstanding issues, whether it's the Tokyo-Takashima island dispute or history questions that have long bedeviled ROK-Japan relations. How much is Yoon going to be constrained there as a chief executive? And then also on the domestic front, we have a question from Watanabe-san, and I think Colin also interested. To the extent that Yoon wants to pursue economic reforms at home, more private sector led, less state led, can he really move that agenda through a legislature that is not sympathetic to his agenda? So, Mark, first with you on the foreign policy front, does Yoon have the freedom to pursue improved relations with Japan? And if he does so and they don't work, is he going to pay a big political price since it may come, there may be wolves barking at the door early in the National Assembly hoping for failure?
A good question, and some initial thoughts, and then but I'll defer to Celeste, who knows South Korean politics much better than I do. But my sense on these foreign policy issues is that Yoon will have a lot of freedom. I mean, because except for budget issues, which sort of lead into the second part of the question, particularly from Watanabe-san. Aside from budget issues, and the National Assembly doesn't have that much ability to directly prohibit or even prescribe certain or promote certain areas for the executive to take. The executive is so powerful in the South Korean political system. And even there's some ways that the National Assembly's budget authority is really much weaker than say the Congresses. So what can the National Assembly do? If they're not happy with something that Yoon is doing, say with Japan, or for that matter, China or the United States, in general, they can embarrass Yoon. They can call hearings, and basically just elevate the prominence of an issue, if they wanted to. Every fall, the National Assembly conducts audits of the executive branch, and they can use those hearings and that process again to highlight and embarrass certain issues. But in general, the national, while it's an irritant, and certainly they can have an indirect effect on the presidency by causing his unpopularity levels to go up, which weakens his influence and might drain his political capital. But in general, if you have a determined president in the Blue House to do something on foreign policy, it's hard for the National Assembly to directly be a roadblock. And Celeste, you may want to disagree with that or modify it, but that's my impression.
Thanks, Mark. And Celeste, on the domestic front, and if I could add another little twist to this, to the extent that Korea may be interested in joining CPTPP, the East Asian regional trading bloc led by Japan, or pursuing deeper integration and coordination with the Quad. I know those are somewhat foreign issues, but they're on the economic front. If you could maybe try to address that as well, please.
Sure, that's a lot to cover, but so I agree with Mark. I think one lesson of the 2015 Comfort Women deal, which Park Geun-hye was a conservative president prior to Moon Jae-in, brokered with then Foreign Minister Kishida Fumio, who is currently the Prime Minister of Japan, is the process through which Korea-Japan relations get resuscitated is very important, not just the outcome. And so far from the President-elect Yoon's campaign, we've been hearing a lot about his desire to communicate with voters. So this is mainly for domestic policy issues, but if he can also apply that to the foreign policy realm, I think he will insulate himself from some of the public opinion backlash that President Park Geun-hye faced in the wake of that sort of quietly negotiated behind closed doors Comfort Women deal in 2015. And the phone call between Prime Minister Kishida and President-elect Yoon did emphasize resolving historical issues in a rational manner, emphasizing mutual shared interests, friendly and cooperative ties, and future-oriented relations. I think these are all good signs. For President-elect Yoon, he will face not just the challenges of a divided government with the National Assembly, but his lack of experience in legislative experience with his own party. He's been a member of the PPP for less than a year, and so the presidency is very powerful. President-elect Yoon talked during the campaign about relocating the president's office and downgrading its importance and not being an imperial president. And so he's going to have to walk a fine line on this. And I think we'll see who he appoints into his administration and the transition team in the coming weeks, how that will fare. But I think as Mark said, for foreign policy, he's maybe less constrained than he is for domestic policy. And the extent to which he can pursue the biggest concerns for everyone, economic issues, inflation, real estate prices, the perceived inequalities in opportunity in South Korean society, and the need for jobs with a 9% unemployment for young people. These are all going to be challenges that he's going to have to face somehow in cooperation with a party that whose voters deeply dislike him and dislike the other side. And even among his own voters, only about 20% selected him for his abilities and his own personal characteristics, or even for his policy proposals. Another 20% selected him for that. He doesn't have a big mandate, and so it's going to be an uphill battle domestically. I think that the emphasis on economic growth and job creation, is including through regional trade partnerships, is all going to be positive. Again, the Democratic Party of Korea, in the supermajority in the National Assembly who lost the presidency, is going to have to figure out what role it's going to play in terms of tackling these concerns that are across all parties. Voters care about these concerns, and so the DPK, the Democratic Party, needs to figure out whether it's going to play a constructive role or an obstructionist role on that.
Thanks, Celeste. I want to delve more deeply into some of those social and socioeconomic issues in a moment. But before we go there, I want to wrap one more foreign policy issue, at least one more that is not foreign policy to Korea, but it's foreign policy to us, which is the DPRK issue. The DPRK is a bit of a wild card in that it has the ability to project itself onto the agenda through its actions. And our audience may be familiar with the expression, only Nixon could go to China, that it took a conservative anti-communist US president to open the door to communist PRC. And I think that there is a widespread presumption that the Democratic Party and the progressives in Korea are more able to achieve improvements in North-South relations than are conservatives who view the North with greater suspicion and reticence to engage. But I would like both of you to just briefly touch on the counterintuitive, which is that, is Yoon better positioned than President Moon to make some kind of incremental progress with the North, if only because anything he does will enjoy probably support from the supermajority in the National Assembly that is dominated by the progressives. Anything he does with the North will probably be limited in scope. It's not going to be a declaration of the end of the Korean War. And perhaps the North Korean expectations also might be tempered by the fact that they know that he's, coming from the conservative side of the house, and they're not going to get the big package that they might have been hoping for. But what are the prospects of North-South relations under President Yoon? Is there any chance at all that this could be a Nixon to China moment, that he might make more progress than his predecessor, or are we likely to be in the deep freeze? Celeste, you want to start?
I hate to predict the future, but I have a pretty dark, cloudy view of the future in the sense that it's not really just up to Yoon, President-elect Yoon. North Korea has not signaled any willingness to make incremental progress. Quite the opposite, I think, and it takes two to tango on this. So unlikely in my mind.
Thank you, Celeste, for that realist view. Mark, anything to add?
I'm thinking back to Park Geun-hye, who Celeste mentioned. She was a conservative, came into office in 2013. And, she, even though she was conservative, she had a track record of engagement with North Korea up until that point. She actually, traveled to North Korea, in the previous decade before she was elected, met with Kim Jong-un's father, Kim Jong-il. And she came out with a policy, well, that was hardline in many ways, but it also emphasized, establishing trust with North Korea. And, and there were some incremental, I wouldn't say breakthroughs, but there were some moments where the two sides were talking and getting together. She was really trying to put an emphasis, for example, on family reunions, and there were some that were held. But at the end of the day, all that stopped in 2016 when Kim Jong-un, went on a missile launch and nuclear testing spree, and that sort of put an end to any breakthrough there. So that just emphasizes Celeste's point that the key variable is North Korea, and I think the indications right now are that North Korea doesn't have any apparent desire to talk, and that they've signaled that they're gearing up for increased testing, perhaps even ICBM testing and nuclear testing. So if that proves to be the case, what you're going to have, that's going to trigger a hardline reaction from Yoon, which in the short term makes any sort of breakthrough less likely. Now, this could all be a way of Kim Jong-un of positioning himself to then, after going through these provocations and other steps, to then seek to come back to the negotiating table, in, I don't know, a year, 2 years or so. And perhaps then Yoon will have the political cover to do a deal, like you're saying, Frank. But in the short term, I think it's very highly unlikely. And in fact, we're likely to see the opposite happen.
Well, the two of you have persuaded me not to be optimistic about North-South relations. And I think the key point is the one that you both emphasize, which is that if the DPRK itself is not going to take the initiative to try to improve relations, there's no reason that we should expect it to be coming from Yoon. It's not an issue among the electorate that put him in office. It's not an area where he has experience or a commitment of, in the past, a passionate commitment like President Moon. So, if the DPRK wants to tango, that's one thing. But if they want to be launching missiles, then we're off to the races, likely on a negative spiral, at least in the near term. Slight variant on the question comes from David Bowling, former Mansfield Foundation and USTR, U.S. Japan negotiator. What's the likelihood that Kishida, I was impressed by Kishida's early phone call to Yoon. I think he was, second or third person to sort of congratulate Yoon on his election. What's the political upside, if any, for Prime Minister Kishida to reach out more affirmatively to President-elect Yoon and to President Yoon when he takes office to try to get things moving on Japan-ROK relations? Yoon has already signaled his own desire to explore what's possible. What about from the Japanese side of this, Mark? Is there an upside for Prime Minister Kishida to explore improved Japan-Korea relations?
Yeah, that's a great question, David, and actually points to perhaps what is the even more important variable in this equation, which is domestic Japanese politics. As David knows well, there's going to be parliamentary elections for Japan's upper house in July that Kishida's got to focus on. And antagonism towards South Korea has been running pretty strong in Kishida's conservative Liberal Democratic Party, the LDP. So there would be some risk to him, perhaps, if he does, reciprocate the outreach there. On the other hand, he may calculate that it's, he should do something, particularly in the early days of the Yoon administration. Again, thinking back to the past, in 2008, when President Lee was inaugurated, and again, Lee was championing stronger, South Korea-Japan ties, Prime Minister Fukuda actually went to the inauguration. And that ushered in this brief, couple year, sort of honeymoon there between the two countries. Now, that was a very different time, very different politicians. But I would be surprised if Kishida didn't, reach out in some way to at least see if there's something that could be done. But I would also be surprised if it were a big grand gesture, like, for example, attending the inauguration. That I think might be a little bit too far, because the sentiment within the conservative wing of the LDP, which is their dominant wing, is that the onus is on South Korea to make the first move and to show something concrete and substantive. So we'll see. Just one other point here is something else to watch on the Japan-South Korea front is how Japan reacts to South Korea's bid to join the CPTPP. And I think that's something, that we could see an early indication of whether there's a softening there in Tokyo's stance on these real hardcore substantive issues towards Seoul or not.
Celeste, this issue is in your wheelhouse. Anything to add to Mark's analysis?
No, I agree with Mark, but I would also say that there are local elections in Korea coming up on June 1st. So to the extent that they may just wait until after these elections, that's possible. But I think we also have a very different geopolitical environment from past moments of a lack of summit meetings, in that U.S.-China tensions have ramped up, and now the Russian invasion of Ukraine has increased the balance of shared common interests between Japan and Korea that I think could potentially tip the scales towards improved relations and hopefully a summit meeting and more working level talks. I mean, we've already seen the meetings in Hawaii and conversations over the phone about North Korea's initiatives for ballistic missile testing / satellite reconnaissance capability testing.
There's nothing like a common threat perception to drive countries with shared values and interests closer together. So I think these developments are trending in favor of improved U.S.-Japan ROK security cooperation, coordination, notwithstanding the challenges of ROK Japan. In the time remaining, I want to focus in a little more on South Korean domestic issues, especially issues of gender equality, inclusivity, and the generational changes underway in South Korea. Celeste, it's fair to say that neither of the leading candidates for presidency, as you said, were endeared themselves to the South Korean electorate. But there is something happening in South Korea with respect to the discussions of gender roles, women in the economy, Me Too movement, and focus on inequality and economic disparities in the society. And some people have pointed to this as kind of a sign of increased polarization within the South Korean body politic. We had a very thoughtful question from one of our viewers about, is this election to be judged a kind of a democratic success story because you had a peaceful transition of power from one party to the next? South Korea has now done this many times successfully, although oftentimes with prosecutions of the previous administration following swiftly on the heels of the inauguration of the new one. Or are we to be maybe concerned by a kind of a breakdown in civility, the closeness of this election, maybe portending troubles ahead for South Korean democracy? I know I've put a lot on the table there, but if you could talk a little bit about your assessment of South Korea's democratic body politic and the issues that they're coming to terms with and how that played out in this election. And where do you see that discussion going? Bill Clinton was able to enact welfare reform, which was sort of a socioeconomic big issue in the United States with a Republican-controlled Congress. Can Yoon do anything with this National Assembly to try to address these issues of inclusivity and opportunity and gender that are clearly animating more and more of the South Korean body politic?
Yeah, these are huge questions, but thanks to Rob for the question about sort of what do I think the health of South Korean democracy is on the basis of this election. I don't think it's that clear of a healthy versus unhealthy. In terms of trust in political parties, I don't think that this was a sign that they are working well, especially with the late minute withdrawal of Ahn Cheol-soo from the race. And he did not even consult members of his own party when doing that, apparently. So in terms of party institutionalization, this is not great. And I think we're going to see some reshuffling after the defeat in the Democratic Party. In terms of voters' trust in their elected officials, so whether they see democracy as voting for your representatives as working, I don't think that the results show that voters do trust their elected representatives very much. They may prefer a more direct, more participatory form of democracy rather than a representational form. But in terms of alternating power peacefully and candidate Lee conceding defeat right away, those were all good signs for peaceful transfer of power. And I think, Frank, you raised the prosecution of your predecessor question. That remains to be seen. There were, I guess, jokes during the campaign that the Democratic Party of Korea would just impeach Yoon if he won. And likewise, Yoon pledged to investigate outgoing President Moon. And there have been so many scandals in this election campaign. I think we'll need, the jury's still out on that, leaving your predecessors alone or investigating them ad nauseum. Certainly Yoon Sung-yeol made a name for investigating corruption, and voters care a lot about corruption. So this is not an easy question. On the social concerns about inequality, I think that's a big one, and it's going to take a long time, and unfortunately maybe even a bursting of a housing bubble, a real estate bubble in Korea to really resolve some of those. Yoon Sung-yeol is also seen by many as elite and privileged. He came from out of the prosecution, which is traditionally thought of as a very hierarchical elite institution wielding too much power in Korean politics. So those folks who did not vote for him in Korea are not going to have much faith that he will be able to solve social inequities. On the campaign trail, he also played into this anti-feminist thread that's running in South Korean society and promised to abolish the Ministry of Gender Equality and Family. Liv, thanks for that question. He would need Democratic Party of Korea support in the National Assembly in order to do that legislatively. So that's going to be an uphill battle for fulfilling that promise. But I also just think it's not great when you're pitting half of the electorate against the other half, the men versus the women in society. And so to figure out whether it's tackling online speech that is anti-women or misogynist, or whether it's addressing the concerns of young men that who feel like they're discriminated against in the job market or in education. The next president is going to have to tackle these deep-seated societal issues of inequity and gender equal opportunity, I guess, across genders. And those are not going to be easy, and they're not going to be solved in a single presidency.
Well, we could continue for another hour, but I want to thank Dr. Celeste Arrington, Korea Foundation Associate Professor of Political Science and International Affairs at GW University, Dr. Mark Manyin, East Asia Specialist at the Congressional Research Service, for a really tour de force looking at South Korea's recent political elections and what it means, both for the Korean people and also, more importantly, perhaps for a U.S. audience, for U.S.-ROK relations and U.S.-ROK Japan attempts to manage peace and stability in Northeast Asia and around the world. I want to thank Sayuri Romay, Associate Director of Programs at the Mansfield Foundation, for bringing this event to fruition. I want to also thank the corporate friends of the Mansfield Foundation, whose generous financial support helps to sustain our outreach to Capitol Hill and our ability to attract such talent and put on programs that are timely and relevant to U.S.-Asia relations. We appreciate all of their support. Celeste, Mark, as usual, fantastic job. You are a credit to the U.S.-Japan Network for the Future. And we appreciate your contributions this afternoon. Mark, I look forward to seeing you at the ballpark. I hope the Nats, go Nats.
Go Nats. Trying to avoid 100 losses.
Try to avoid 100 losses. Sayuri, any final word about upcoming programs or thanks for our audience, please?
Yeah, thank you, Frank. And thank you, of course, Mark and Celeste, for your excellent analyses. And we could talk for hours about this topic, and I wish we had more time. Sorry, we didn't have time to respond to all your questions, but thank you to everyone who joined the discussion today. Please keep an eye out for our next CAP event. We don't have a date yet, but it will be later in the spring. And subscribe to our newsletter. And again, feel free to email me. My email is in the chat if you have any suggestions, questions on the series. And to congressional staff attending today, thank you. Thanks for your questions. And please let your colleagues know about our Capitol Hill Dialogue series. So yeah, thank you so much for joining us, and I hope you will join our next CAP event later this spring. So, and thanks, speakers.
Thanks all.